Nancy's cooked and our daughter's coming over, so.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But we'll catch you maybe here soon.
So we can't talk you into Stony River.
No, not today. Yeah, I think she's already cooking. So. All right, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. First Corinthians chapter 7. I'm not sure I'm on. Am I on? Yeah. Now I'm on. Okay. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I'm going to pick up in verse 17 here in a little bit. Appreciate everybody's attendance here this morning. We have been in a section that really goes back to chapter 5, where Paul was dealing with some gross immorality. In chapter 6, he, after addressing a legal matter, starts talking about immorality in general, particularly sexual immorality. We looked last week in the first part of chapter 7, where the solution for the temptation of sexual immorality is found in marriage. But he also deals with some issues of worldly philosophy being applied to marriage and some of the issues that created in the Corinthians' thinking. In fact, last week, as we started through this, I highlighted verses 17, 20, and 24 because it really shows what the issue was that was in the Corinthians' mind. Some of them were of the mindset that because they were new creatures, because they had become Christians, that all sorts of prior relationships were ended, were taken away. And that they were, Paul said they were new creatures. So I'm not married anymore, or I'm not a slave anymore, or I'm not Jewish anymore, or whatever it might be. And so they had applied that worldly thinking and applied it to the marriage contract. And Paul said that's not so. And then right here in the middle of chapter 7, in a chapter that is on marriage, he has these things to say about all relationships when someone transitions from being a non-Christian to becoming a Christian. So verses 17 through 24, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he was free when called as a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Throughout this quarter, I pointed out the fact that the issue in the Corinthians' mind was applying worldly philosophy to things, then mixing it with the gospel and misunderstanding the outcome. How else do you explain a chapter that is on marriage in the middle having a discussion about bondservants and circumcision? It makes no sense unless you have that context. And you understand that the underlying problem that contributed to some of the misunderstandings about marriage was this view of what it meant to become a new creature. So he provides some other illustrations here to make sure they understand that wholesome conditions, not immoral conditions, but wholesome conditions that existed before you were a Christian are not ended as you become a Christian. And he uses a couple of illustrations. He talks about the difference between Jews and Greeks. And, of course, you're well aware of Jewish legalism that would have asked the Gentiles to become Jews and to be circumcised. He said, no, you don't do that. You don't go through that. He talks here about bondservants, slavery. Now, we don't need to associate that with our mindset of the American slavery experience. Slavery in that context was very different. You could have professionals who were not free, and so we don't have time to go into the details of that, but it's vastly different. But the gospel did not come in to undo the condition of free and slave. That happened over time as people understood the love of God. And so he says, just because you became a Christian doesn't mean your prior relationship doesn't end. Or perhaps some would say, if I don't need to worry about things in the world, I'll become a slave and under the administration and guardianship and care of someone else. And so some had that mindset as well, so they could focus on spiritual things only. Either way, he says, whatever condition you're in when you're called, you should stay there. But don't miss the point. The whole reason this discussion is going on, it's in the center of a chapter that has to do with marriage. They were misunderstanding Paul's teaching about what it meant to be a new creature. Now, beginning with verse 25, he goes on in a fairly lengthy section that's not that hard to understand on another question that was asked. Remember the formula? Now concerning. That means they wrote him a letter and they asked about certain things. And so, beginning with verse 25. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgments as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. The married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. The unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. All right, now, the question they were asked is, okay, well, what about couples that are engaged? I mean, they were engaged and became Christians. Should they get married? Should they not get married? Now, we don't understand all the different aspects of their particular marriage practices, but their engagements tended to be longer, perhaps, at least in the Jewish context, a little bit more contractual. And so the question came up, given their views of marriage, Paul talked about the fact that potentially, like him, not being married was helpful. What should we do? It's a reasonable question that they ask. And so he says he gives a judgment, and he really gives it across two lines. One we sometimes refer to as the present distress. And then secondly is along the lines of the administration of life. So the first part of this is about the present distress. Paul knew and understood that they live in times with the potential for great persecution. He had incurred it himself. Wouldn't be too many more years after this when Nero is going to cause a great deal of problem in Rome. Later on, Domitian just murdering Christians. He's aware of that. Having a family in that environment, having to care for a spouse in that environment, very detrimental. And so he talks about those, they should act as if they're going to be in a situation where it's as if they didn't have a spouse. It's as if they didn't have worldly goods because the world is going to be very, very difficult for them to live in. And so consider, giving that particular environment and that circumstances, the present distress, whether marriage is the best option. But the second thing has to do with the administration of life. He uses the word anxieties, the focus on worldly things. Now, this is not making one thing particularly spiritually higher than another, but it's the reality of life. When you are married, you have certain responsibilities to your spouse. There are things that you have to care for and take care of. There's administration. We can read the Proverbs 31 woman and see the wondrous blessings that she provides to her family. Most of those things are worldly things that have to be taken care of, that take a lot of time and administration and consideration and doing. And in a marriage environment, part of your spiritual duty is to carry out those things. Same thing for the husband. Whether it's providing for the family, he's not feeding one mouth, he's feeding two or many, or whatever it might be. And so there's also an understanding here from Paul that if you are married, understand you've got some responsibilities. If you were not married, you might have the ability to do things more from a spiritual standpoint. It's sort of been my experience that this particular lesson's been difficult for preachers to understand and missionaries. A lot of times you'll have an individual who is a very talented preacher, has a great deal of ability, and he's off saving souls. And guess who very easily he can leave behind? I'm a preacher's kid. Preacher's kids get a bad rap. Some of it's deserved because the dad wasn't there. My dad was very good, but others are not, right? That's what happens is there may be this continuous concern for spiritual things, forgetting your administrative and love responsibilities to your family. And that sometimes can happen. Not too many years ago, I had a conversation with a young man who was traveling all over the world doing missionary work, kids and everything. And I said, I had to sat down with him, had a conversation. You got a first responsibility, you need to take care of that responsibility. Think about the difficult position that puts the wife in, complaining about him doing spiritual work. How does that feel? I think it's very important when we talk to young people, particularly those that are engaged in good spiritual work, that you have a conversation that says there are administrative responsibilities in marriage that you have to tend to. Now, let's go on with that and read the rest of this. It said, if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly, this is verse 36, towards his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and he has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I have to have the Spirit of God. Now, there's a little bit of debate that goes on about verses 36 through 38, about whether it's talking about the father in the situations of arranged marriages, or the potential groom in the case of they're engaged and trying to decide what to do. It really doesn't matter because the point is the same. The answer is the same. If they want to get married, if they need to get married, let them get married. That's great. But do it under the consideration of the present distress and the administration of life. And if you do that and you understand that, then it's fine for them to get married. And then Paul says, that there'll be some concerns potentially in that, because life can happen in that context, particularly at a time of persecution, but there's nothing wrong with them getting married. Now, verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. Well, that goes all the way back to the early part of the chapter where it talks about the Lord addressed all this. And when the Lord addressed it in Matthew 19, he referred to Genesis chapter 3. So this is all well known and understood, but he wanted to make this point that a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies. And I think you can do this both ways, whether it's talking about a widow or a widower. They're free to be married to whom they wish, only in the Lord. Now that little phrase, only in the Lord, has caused debates for years. Some would read that. Generally, when the scriptures say in the Lord, it means in Christ. In other words, if you are a widow or a widower, only marry a Christian. Now, I will tell you that under any definition or any circumstance, that's a good idea. That's the way we ought to think about it. And best, we just stop there. Now, there is a debate about whether only in the Lord insists on that. And there's an exception that is always pulled out, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Does that mean you don't have to obey your parents if they're not Christians? And so there'll be some debate goes back and forth on that. I would say one exception doesn't nullify the rule, My view is that a widow or widower Christian that's going to remarry should only marry Christian. That seems to be what the intent here is. I'd also say it's common sense, and that's the right thing to do it. There is reference often given to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, about not associating with things that are associated with Belial. And you can read that, and in some ways having unequally yoked together. In some ways you could apply that to marriage, but the context does not apply that to marriage. It applies it to a wide, broad variety of things. So that's the debate that goes on there. But Paul's judgment is that may be better if they're not married. There's a stage in life when people should get married, particularly younger. If they're older, they may want companionship. There's nothing wrong with that. That is fine. The suggestion here is only in the Lord, as I would say, it's best to marry a Christian. All right, let me stop there. I went through that very quickly, somewhat because we're behind, but there's not a lot of complexity in this. Questions that you have? Thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, virgin, young maiden. Some will say unmarried daughter. It can all mean that. It's a broad word that can mean different things. So if you did see, you can see all those different things. Which part of it contributes to the problem of, is it talking about the father, talking about his unmarried daughter, or is it talking about the young man as a potential groom who is engaged to a young lady? So that's the issue, and that's why people struggle with it a little bit. In the end, the point's the same, right? They can get married if they want to. Here's what you need to think about. So, anyone else? All right, let's go into chapter 8. This is a chapter that begins a section that goes through chapter 10. And I've always labeled this in my mind as advanced Christianity. And it's interesting because the Corinthians were spiritually very immature. But they were having to deal with issues. And so Paul, who knew they weren't ready for certain things, has to address some problems that really require an advanced way of thinking. And so just have in your mind, we're talking about hard stuff to do in chapters 8 through 10. Now you'll see the very first line is now concerning food offered to idols. We have to set some background here. The initial issue there is so foreign to us, we can't wrap our heads around it, right? I don't sit around worried about food offered to idols, right? That's not where we live. That's not who we are. There are principles that come out of this that are very applicable, but we've got to understand the context and the background to know what's going on. Corinth, as well as most of the Roman world, was very pagan. Many pagan gods. And there were many festivals, sacrifices, priests, temples, and all those things are associated with that. And there was quite a bit of that in Corinth, as wouldn't be surprised by that. The individuals that had been Gentiles that had become Christians, they had been doing that their whole life. They had been going to very public events that involved the worshiping of the gods. And part of those public events included feasts, where priests would slay animals and say, this is offered to God or goddess so-and-so or whatever. And then they would cook it, and then they would eat it. And part of that festivity was in worship to that god or goddess. That was their life. That was most of the public in some way or another that was involved in that. In fact, some will go so far as to say that any meat you bought on the streets in Corinth had already been through a sacrificial process offered to the gods. They didn't need to have a slaughterhouse. They had a temple. That's the way they did it. And so it was impossible, potentially, to buy meat to eat unless it had been offered to one of these pagan gods. So with that background, let's read the first few verses. Now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagined that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. All right, so now what's going on here? Knowledge. What is the knowledge that needs to be known here? The knowledge that needs to be known is all those pagan gods are just pieces of stone or wood or whatever it might be. They're not gods at all. There's only one God, the God of heaven. And those with knowledge in the church knew that. And so if I know that those gods don't mean anything, well, I don't really care where that meat's been. It doesn't make any difference, right? I mean, there's nothing devilish about it. It's not been hurt in any way. It's just food. And so I can just eat that food. Paul's going to talk about that and some of the struggle with it. He says that this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Let's go back and remind ourselves this word knowledge and know, that's gnosko, that's the Gnostic. Remember you're talking about a lot of the pre-Gnostic elements that were in this. That's the idea later that came along of being enlightened. And now that I'm a Christian, I am enlightened. I am more enlightened than you. And so therefore I have superior knowledge. I'm above all this stuff about pagan idols and all that. I can eat any meat I want. Doesn't make any difference. So you get the knowledge. It's true. The idols mean nothing. But then you get the puffed up, the make arrogant. And, knowing something can make you like that. It can make you look down on other people and can make you not think about somebody else's concern. And so he says they're puffed up. But then he says, but love, and that's the word agape, not surprising, builds up. It's not enough just to know something. It's to apply it well in a way that considers others. That's what agape is. It's the service to others. It's the actions towards others. And what this whole section is going to be about is how you and I might know something is just fine, but we may well choose not to do it or not to say it or not to be around it because there's somebody among my brothers and sisters who are newer in the faith and they might get the wrong idea. Now that's incredibly challenging, by the way, to apply, and we'll talk about that. But that's the principle that is laid out here. So he says in verse 2, if anyone imagines that he knows anything, he does not know as he ought to know. There's a phrase that's, you don't know what you don't know, you know. And that's exactly right. And Paul's pulling that out. He's saying, okay, you know, but you don't really know. Because you're not thinking about other people, which is what you really need to know about, is how it impacts other people. And then in verse 3, I think he makes a play again on this Gnosticism. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. You want to be enlightened? You want to be the gnosis one? You want to be the one with knowledge? The way you do that is you love God. You know how you love God? You love your fellow brother. And if you love your fellow brother, you love God. And the result of that is then God knows you. And that's the knowing you really want. It's not what you know, but that God knows you. And I think he's making a little bit of a play on that. So now he confirms in verse 4 the truth. He says, now you got the truth right. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence. It's nothing. It's wood, it's stone. There's no God but one. Okay, so we're not having a debate about what truth is here, right? He said, you got the truth. That's fine. You've got all that just right. And then he goes through some explanation of that, etc. And then the declaration of verse 6, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and whom we exist, one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. We got the knowledge down. So let's go on, verse 7. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, no better off if we do. Take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. If anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in the idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So he says, you got the knowledge right, but there's some that don't have all that knowledge straight, not clear in their head. They've got former associations. They have things that this reminds them of. They're still weak in their faith. You're hurting them. You're creating potential for them. We'll go through a number of illustrations here in a little bit, but there was a man in church in another place who spent quite a bit of time in the early 80s in a rock and roll band, his young 20s, listening to all the music, frankly, that I like to listen to from the times. And he did some things during that time that he's not proud of. Not surprising. He's a great man today. So if he got in my car, I'm not going to play Aerosmith. If you don't know, that's from that era. But anyway, so I'm not going to play Aerosmith, right? I'm not going to play that, all right? Because I know that that's going to bring to his mind, music is a powerful memory jogger. It's going to bring to his mind things that he behaved in that he'd rather forget. See, that's the kind. Now, we can have a debate about whether I should listen to Aerosmith or not. That's no discussion. But generally, it's a consideration, right, of somebody else. You can do something that's fine, but you don't do it because it could hurt someone else. Very simple, easy illustration of the point that's laid out here because of the former association. So what was going on is these individuals who were young Christians, they had been to all these festivals from the time they were children. And the way they thought about it is, oh, this is the God of this, and this is the God of that, and this is this. And now they get this every time they eat a steak. All those memories come flooding back. And they have a weakness of association, and it offends their conscience. So he says in verse 9, and this is the headline that he's going to get to, but take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Spiritual growth is a process. We talked about this at the very beginning of the book, is young Christians, particularly that come from a difficult environment, are going to stumble a lot as they're trying to get to where they need to be. And we need to have the patience to recognize that. Sometimes, somebody will become a Christian and they've been involved in certain things and they may slip back. And sometimes other Christians will write them off. Horrible. The other thing that sometimes happens is they don't recognize that we're contributing to the very problem that they're having. Because, there's nothing wrong with this, right? Well, there isn't anything wrong with that, except for how it's hitting them. And that's a very different way of thinking things, and why I think about this as being advanced Christianity. And so he explains in verses 10 and 11 the weakness that could occur with somebody. He talks about wounding their conscience. Now, we have a lot of discussions about conscience. Conscience should not be your guide alone, right? Your conscience has to be educated. But if something bothers your conscience, you shouldn't be doing it, even if it's right. And I think that's some of the things that are going on here is they're like, I probably shouldn't be eating this meat, but brother so-and-so is, so I guess I'll just jump in, right? That's what's going on in this particular case. And that brother's conscience is not offended, but the weaker Christian's is. And so considering that and thinking about that, you have to be very careful. And so he says, by sinning against your brother and wounding them. Now what this says is that I could be doing something that in and of itself is perfectly right, but it has a negative effect on somebody else. That's sin. That's sin. You think about that. People will say things like, well, the Lord knows my heart, right? Yeah, he also knows what you're doing to somebody else. And I think that's a very, very difficult thing for us to go through. It's about curbing our liberties in consideration for others. Let me give you some examples. Some of these are old examples. Some of those of you that are older will recognize this. Some of them are a little bit more current. So, you mow your yard on Sunday afternoon? Any consideration there? Well, it's not Sabbath. Absolutely not. If you want to study that, but I have knowledge, it's not Sabbath. Nothing wrong with mowing your yard on Sunday afternoon, technically. If you live in a Jewish community, as I did for a time in Baltimore, you'll be out there with everybody else, right? But then you live near somebody who thinks Sunday's a Sabbath. What's happened to your influence with them? Well, he's a heathen. Or your other reaction might be, they need to learn this lesson, so let me get out here and mow this yard. See how hard it gets when you start thinking about what to do? But again, if you're older, you'll remember a time when nobody would mow their yard on Sunday that was Christian, right? Even though it wasn't the Sabbath. I was going to use the Christmas illustration, but I'll use today's illustration. Easter. Okay? Now, what's the point here? Years ago, and by the way, I love Dan's sermon. He did the right thing. Years ago, you wouldn't preach on the resurrection on Easter. You know why? Because the denominational world's confused about the authority of creating religious holidays that don't exist in Scripture. We're not going to follow that practice. Or if they did it, there had been a 5-minute dissertation about that speech, and then they would do it, right? What are you trying to do? Well, I'm weighing. All right, well, I can preach about Easter, resurrection, anytime I want to, right? But I'm also trying to think about how it might influence somebody the wrong way, and they might have a misunderstanding. Perhaps some more applicable ones today. Nonconformity in dress and appearance. I'm not this old, but there was a time if you had a white t-shirt on and rolled it up over your shoulders, you were associated with a certain type of person. It was an appearance, right? Today, there are other things that are non-conforming in appearance. Does a Christian do that? Does a Christian not do that? How far do you go? Where does it go? We'll get into chapter 11, some things around gender identity that are pretty significant, etc. But there are things that you have to think about as to who you are. I remember the hair wars at my house when I was a teenager. All right, there was the hair wars about how long it got. And part of that was an issue of it makes you look like you're rebellious whether you are or not. So you have these kind of discussions that go on. And so it's a consideration of the influence that you have on other people. Do you listen to instrumental Christian music in your car? Would you do that if somebody got in the car with you? Would you think about that? What they might think about that? The influence that might have? Those kinds of things. There was a time when people wouldn't walk into a restaurant that had a bar in it. I'm not sure you can get in a restaurant that doesn't have a bar today, but there was a time, right? So my point in all these, and some of these are older examples, is we have to take some discernment and some judgment and thinking about how things look to other people. It matters. That's advanced Christianity. Now, there's two reactions that people have to this. One is they dismiss it. And they say, well, the Lord knows in my heart I'm right. And this is okay, and this is not a problem. They miss the point. I think the other is you throw up your arms in frustration and says, well, I can't do anything. I mean, what do you do in these things, in these situations? I think the point here is the mindset. It's the mindset that says, I need to think about, with agape love, others, and that are my actions negatively influencing others in some way, whether I'm doing something that's just right, just fine, or not. The last thing I would say about this, and if there's anything that you remember about all this, remember this. Do not judge another person on this question, because it's the hardest thing to figure out. You know, we don't need to be going around, well, I can't believe he did that because that looks like this, or I can't believe she did that because that looks like that. You may not even know the circumstance. This is hard enough as it is. I got a full-time job taking care of myself trying to manage this. Don't be judging other people about it, or other churches, or whatever it might be. All right, let me stop there and see what questions or comments you have. That might have stirred some things up. Go ahead. I didn't know that. I'm sorry you know that, Marilyn. Okay.
And so I was very much aware, maybe silly, but I was concerned about going there because if someone saw me there, they would assume, or they would say, what in the world is Marilyn going into this for? Rather than
Right.
it was the boxes.
All right.
So what I did do, and I called them and I said, do you ever let people have boxes? Yes. And I said, could you just set them outside the restaurant or whatever? And so he did. So
Yeah.
I didn't have to go in.
Well, that's good.
I mean, so that's kind of a silly thing, but.
That's the questions that you ask, right? Because that's part of the process of how does this look. Innocent? Absolutely, perfectly innocent. But how do things look? And that's what this is about. How do things look to somebody else? Because somebody else could get the idea, well, Marilyn, she's an elder's wife. She must think it's okay to drink. Well, I wasn't even going to say that. I wasn't even going to say that. She probably took black magic markers and real. Go ahead.
It's like my mom had gotten a recipe for beer rolls.
Beer rolls, okay,
And
yeah.
they're delicious. It's
Yeah.
just quick sugar and a warm can of beer.
Okay,
And so I had told a friend about the recipe,
right,
and she was trying to kind of nonchalantly buy her beer.
right.
And she said, I got up to checkout, and the checkout person was like, price check on the
That's right. So, and other examples or questions? Yeah, Frank?
So, landscaping folks came on Friday and didn't get finished. They showed up this morning, and I'm sitting there thinking, I cannot believe they're going to have a landscaping fix on my yard. Easter morning.
Yeah,
So I told them, I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm going to look terrible to them if I walk out there and say, we're headed to church, can y'all get out of our yard?
yeah,
That wouldn't look bad. I don't think that would sound very good if the Christians ran us out of their yard.
right,
I mean, so we just kind of waved and left.
yeah. I understand, and this stuff's hard, right? So, but the point is, you have to think about it. And I think that's what Paul is calling us to do here, is to at least think about it and how things might look to other people. Yes, sir.
In Romans 14, Paul deals with a different aspect
Yep.
of the same concept,
Yep,
and it refers to the weaker brother,
yep,
not meaning weak in the faith, but weak in his understanding of the principle. But what I've seen in my experience is that where problems of judging arise, to your point on don't judge your brother over this, is that the weaker brother often doesn't realize he's the weaker brother.
yeah,
And he has this very strong conscience reaction to something that he thinks is wrong, when really it's okay.
yeah, yeah.
And thus he can't understand why another Christian will do this when he has such a strong conscience regarding it.
Well, and yeah, those examples. By the way, if somebody comes up to you and says, you need to do what I said because I'm the weaker brother, don't listen to that, because that's been used, right? But I think this is where, elders have to get together and talk about it. I mean, there may be reasons not to do because they have a challenge with it or whatever, but very, very difficult. And yeah, I should have mentioned Romans 14 is very much a sister passage to this. Back there.
A few years back, I was in my office and I received an email. Everybody received an email that was free food in the conference room. So I rushed to the office, to the conference room, and I started eating the
Right.
So after the fact, I learned that I ate something that was dedicated to another God.
Right.
So I think what you said at the beginning, that's true. We are not really with that problem other than the conscience of someone else. But as we are globalized and many people are moving in and they're bringing their custom and their religion,
That's a good point.
we need to be careful.
You got to be careful.
Actual dedication to another God.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you had knowledge that that's not a God, but somebody observing you might think, well, he thinks this God's fine too, right? So that's the kind of thing that you think about and try to figure out. So someone over here had a hand? Yeah.
I have enough stories, but when we were younger, there was this new fad that went around about putting beer in your hair in the shower. It gave you great volume. And so they even came out with a shampoo called Body on Tap.
Okay.
And I'm really dating myself. So we went to Mom and said, Mom, we would have great healthy hair if we just added
A little bit of beer.
with 4 girls, we were all into our hair.
Right.
And Mama said, oh, I don't think so, but I don't think your daddy would get it. She was like, I understand the concept, but I don't think.
Yeah.
So we went to Daddy and asked him, and Daddy said, absolutely no. And we were mortified, but Daddy, we were little girls, we just wanted body in our hair.
Hey, that's right.
We were like, Daddy, why can't you just go get a can of beer?
Beer, that's right. Body in your hair. That's called a miracle, brother. The Jews? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The Jews, and he's talking about Jews and kosher and the issues that are there. And by the way, I didn't really mention this in the middle of chapter of 7, but you got to remember that this was a transitionary period where the Jews were doing some things that were Jewish, even though they were Christians. And if you have any question about that, see Acts 22, what Paul did when he went to Jerusalem. So they were doing some of those things, and Paul would have said, no, you Gentiles don't do that. And so they have this mix going on as well. So you're exactly right, the whole kosher thing. So, yes, sir.
My mother used to make rum pudding.
Yeah?
It was really good.
Yeah.
She made sure that there was plenty of fire in front of everybody when she served it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you want to be sure that it was well cooked. That's exactly right. Yeah. But I think, as our, and I think the point was made, as our society shifts and becomes more diverse, we're going to be challenged with these things more and more, especially as we bring the gospel to people that have no idea about the past Christian Judeo values. These questions are going to come up and we're going to be challenged by it. But remember what I said, do not judge one another. It is a full-time job to take care of yourself. Yes, sir.
Brother, I can't help but sit here and think, if we all handled it like Galatians 5:22 teaches.
Yep, kindness. Yep.
And it doesn't matter if you've been an old member in the brotherhood or you've been a young member.
Yep.
You still need to have patience and care and love them. Not come over in a judgmental way. I've been a member of the Church of Christ a long time. That's been a problem.
It can be, yes.
And we need to be on guard for that.
Yeah, well, and that's what he said right up front. Knowledge puffs up, but it's love that edifies. It's the agape. So love wins everything. You got to have that basic of truth, but then you apply it with the agape. So very good. Well, that is a great place to start. We'll go into We'll go into chapter 9 next week. At all. Yeah.